The first time it happened, no one believed Grace Pohl. A single voice emerging from 20 mouths at once sounded too much like madness. Yet she never forgot it. She remembered the air. It had that metallic heaviness that comes before a storm, though the sky above Unity Falls was perfectly clear. She remembered standing before her classroom of children, asking them to recite the morning psalm. They began, as they always did, in varying tones and rhythms, but by the second line, the sound aligned. Every voice became one, identical in pitch, pacing, and inflection. Different mouths, one voice. And yet, each child swore afterward they had spoken their own words. Grace wasn't new to hysteria. She had seen it sweep through river towns during fever seasons, seen panic give shape to nonsense. But this was different. What chilled her wasn't what she heard, but what she saw, or didn't. There was no confusion in their eyes, no sense of alarm or wonder. They hadn't noticed it at all. Unity Falls, South Dakota, wasn't on most maps in 1831. It stood at the edge of the known world, where railroad surveys had yet to reach and missionaries still debated whether to convert or retreat. A village of 147 souls, Unity Falls had no newspaper, no telegraph, and no visiting preacher. Just the long Dakota wind, a wooden chapel, and the voices of its people. Until those voices became something else. The village was founded in 1817 by followers of Reverend Veidt, a firebrand dissenter who believed that true spiritual peace came only through communal harmony, not just in purpose, but in thought. His sermons were filled with strange references, the chorus of salvation, the alignment of will, and most famously, the single tongue of the redeemed. He died in 1823, but his phrases endured. Still, no one expected them to become literal. Mayor Dorian Flint had been a rational man once. A merchant by trade, he came to Unity Falls to escape the corruption he'd seen back east. Men buying churches with tobacco money, elections won with liquor, widows losing farms to forged ledgers. He believed in order, in rules that held, in truth that could be tallied like coins. But by September of 1831, even Flint admitted something was wrong. It began with Grace's students, then the mothers. At first, just during hymns, then meal times, and finally, during casual conversation. Differing words. One sound. A shopkeeper asked two farmers what kind of flour they needed. Both gave different answers, but the same voice emerged. Neighbors quarreled about fence lines, chickens, inheritance. The disputes were real. The voices were not. Carpenter Isaac Bain kept to himself before it all began. A widower, he lived on the western slope with his son, Elias. He was not given to storytelling, but when he spoke of the night, Elias began sleep-talking in someone else's voice. No one laughed. "It wasn't my boy's tone," Isaac told the mayor. "It was deeper, older, and it said, 'The tongue is only a door. What matters is what walks through.'" That same week, 3 women at the well sang a harvest song in perfect harmony, though one was deaf in her left ear and another had never heard the tune before. The question whispered most often behind closed doors was not what was happening, but when had it started? When did they first stop noticing the sameness? Had it begun last spring, the previous winter? Were they all just slow to see it? The first to go silent entirely was Samuel Hook, the town gravedigger. He'd buried 28 villagers over 13 years, each one recorded in his pocket ledger. He stopped speaking on October 4th. Not from illness or injury, but refusal. He simply wrote, "Not my voice anymore." When Mayor Flint visited him, Samuel handed him a page torn from his ledger. One sentence was written there, in neat cursive. They said different things, but it came out as one voice. The mayor folded the note without comment, but as he left the gravedigger's home, he realized something had changed in the air, a stillness, as if the land itself had taken a breath and was holding it, and then, as he stepped into the main street of Unity Falls, He heard it. Everyone was speaking at once. Children, merchants, elders, even the stray dogs barking. But the sound that emerged was singular, unbroken, unified, and not one of them seemed to notice. Mayor Dorian Flint stood in the center of Unity Falls, his boots rooted in the dust, hands trembling at his sides. He should have shouted. He should have demanded silence, made an announcement, called a meeting. But no words came. Not because he was afraid to speak, because he feared what voice might come out if he did. Instead, he walked. Slowly, past the blacksmith shop where Isaac Bain hammered iron with rhythmic precision, past the schoolhouse where Grace Pohl sat in silence while her students recited arithmetic answers in eerie synchrony. Even past his own home, where his wife Agnes stood on the porch feeding crows from her palm, humming a melody he didn't recognize, and neither, it seemed, did she. Later that evening, Dorian locked himself in his office at the back of the chapel. It was the only room in Unity Falls that had never been part of Reverend Veidt's original blueprints. He paced the floorboards until the candles burned low, then took out the old town ledger, the one used before Veidt's time when the village was still called Cold River Crossing. The name startled him. Dozens of families who had since moved or died. None of them remembered now, or rather remembered differently. Even the founding year was in dispute. The town sign said 1817, but the ledger clearly marked a settlement in 1809. 8 years unaccounted for. 8 years erased from shared memory. Across the village, in a home lit only by lamplight and prayer, Grace Pohl wrote in her journal by oil's dim glow. Her handwriting was sharp, meticulous, but her words were hesitant. "I asked the children again today what they remembered from the morning," she wrote. "They each recalled a different topic. Eli said we studied maps. Ruth swears we recited psalms. Jonah insists I let them nap. But I never dismissed class, and I never said a word." She paused, listening to the wind. It had picked up again, howling low between the buildings like a voice too distant to understand, but too persistent to ignore. Then she continued. "Isaac Bain came by to mend the desk leg. He said nothing, not at first, but when I asked if he noticed it too, his expression darkened. 'It's not their voices that worry me,' he said. 'It's what's listening to them.'" At the edge of town, Isaac Bain sat by the fireplace with his son Elias asleep beside him. Elias had not spoken since the incident. Not aloud, at least. He mouthed words silently now, lips moving as if in conversation. But with no one present, Isaac had started keeping a tally of each time Elias did it. Today was the 7th occurrence. Always just before dawn, always facing east, Isaac lit a second lamp and pulled a thin, worn volume from the back of the shelf. Reverend Veidt's final sermon, copied by hand, never published. The leather cover was cracked, the ink fading, but the words were legible. "When voices become one, the veil thins. When thought aligns, the gate opens. Beware the day of harmony, for it is not peace, it is preparation." Isaac read the line again. "It is not peace, it is preparation." That night, Mayor Flint called a meeting in the chapel, but only 5 people came. Grace Pohl, Dr. Isaac Bain, the widow Estelle, Samuel Hook's sister, Ruth, and a boy named Levi, who had stopped blinking entirely. They spoke in hushed tones, sharing observations they'd kept to themselves for weeks. The voices, the perfect synchrony. The dreams, oh, the dreams, shared by strangers. Identical in detail. A silver field, a dark spire, a sound like singing through teeth. It was Grace who asked the question no one wanted to voice. What if it's not a disease? They were silent. What if it's not possession or madness or sin? Still silence. What if it's the town? At that, Levi turned his head and said in a voice too deep for his frame, "Unity is not the sickness. Division was the wound." And then he smiled. but it wasn't his smile. The room fell still. The silence was so complete that the crackling of the chapel's hearth sounded like gunfire. Mayor Flint felt the air shift. Again, that same pressure, that same invisible presence pressing inward from all sides. Something ancient, something waiting. Levi blinked slowly, then looked around as if confused. When asked what he'd just said, he replied only, "Did I say something?" Grace Pohl reached for her satchel, pulling out the small slate she used with her students. She began writing names, those who had changed, those who hadn't. She handed the slate to Isaac, who nodded grimly. "Too many," he muttered, "and the changes are getting faster." The widow Estelle spoke next. Her voice trembled, but her words were clear. "It began with the river," she said. "Back in spring, before the frost even left the fields. I remember because the water turned silver one morning, not like ice. Brighter, like it was catching moonlight, but it was full sun that day." None of them had heard that before. Estelle had told no one. She'd thought it was her eyes, but when she went to fetch water, the bucket came up warm, not hot, not cold, warm, and it stayed warm until dusk. Isaac leaned forward. "What lies under the river?" No one answered, because no one knew. No one had ever dredged it, no one fished it. It was narrow, shallow, unremarkable. Or so they thought. Grace said it aloud. What if something came up through it? It was Ruth Hook who added the final, strangest detail. "My brother," she whispered. "He used to sing while digging graves. Always did. Said it kept the voices away. He said the ground hums back if you listen long enough." She paused. "But he stopped singing. A month ago. He told me it was because the earth started answering in a different pitch." The 5 of them agreed to investigate. That night, no more meetings, no more notes. They would go together to the river bend where Estelle first noticed the change. Midnight came, and the 5 figures moved silently through the narrow streets, shadows stretching unnaturally beneath the silver moon. Unity Falls was quiet. Too quiet. Not a single dog barked, no doors creaked, no lamps burned. The town had folded in on itself like a sleeping beast. They reached the river. Its banks were still. No wind, no frogs, no ripple of fish. The surface was smooth as polished stone, reflecting not just the moon, but something beneath. As Grace knelt with a lantern, she gasped. There were symbols at the bottom, not carved into stone but glowing faintly through the silt, lines and curves that pulsed like veins. She whispered, "It's language." Isaac stepped forward and touched the surface with his hand. The water didn't resist. It parted like mist, and then the hum began. It was low, almost inaudible, but they all heard it, not with ears, but with something deeper. A pressure in the bones, a vibration in the chest. The hum became a tone. The tone became a chord, and in that chord, they heard words, not in English, not in Dakota, but in something older, yet they understood. "You called yourselves many, but you were always one." Mayor Flint stumbled backward. "It's sentient." "No," said Grace, "it's collective." The symbols in the water pulsed once more, then the surface froze solid. Not with ice, but with stillness, as if time itself had paused above the current. The lantern dimmed. The hum stopped. Behind them, Unity Falls stood unchanged, yet as they returned, something in the air had shifted again. Windows now glowed faint blue. Footsteps echoed in rhythm, and the wind carried the unmistakable sound of singing. One voice, but far too many mouths. By dawn, the chapel bells rang, but no hand had pulled the rope. Grace Pohl was the first to arrive, drawn by the sound. The doors stood open, and every pew was filled. Men, women, children, all seated in perfect stillness. No one moved, no one blinked, all eyes fixed on the pulpit, where there stood no preacher, and yet The sermon had begun. The voice that filled the room came from nowhere and everywhere. It wasn't loud, but it penetrated the skull like cold steel. It spoke not in threats, but in perfect conviction. You have wandered, you have fractured, but the time of scatter is ended. The alignment has begun. Isaac Bain arrived minutes later. He did not enter. He simply stood outside, listening, watching. His carpenter's hands clenched, knuckles white. He had built the altar 10 years earlier. Now it pulsed with a faint inner glow, like coals just beneath the surface. From inside came the voice again. You thought selfhood sacred, but the sacred is shared. One mind, one will, one tongue. Then, as if on cue, the entire congregation stood in unison. They turned slowly and began to walk. Out the doors, down the steps, into the street. Their eyes did not register Isaac or Grace. They moved like one body with many limbs, heading toward the river. Where are they going? Grace whispered. Isaac shook his head. They're not going anywhere, he said. They're returning. Mayor Flint had not slept. The night at the river had broken something inside him. Not his resolve, but the frame in which he housed it. He now understood the threat was not invasion, but absorption. Something was not coming into Unity Falls. It had always been here. Waiting. By mid-morning, the town center was silent again. But now, silence didn't mean peace. It meant attention. As if something unseen was now fully awake, watching every movement of the few who had not yet aligned. The resistance, if it could be called that, consisted of just 6 people. Flint, Grace, Isaac, Widow Estelle, Ruth Hook, and young Elias, whose silence had turned to drawing. Dozens of pages, diagrams, spirals, faces with no eyes. He never repeated an image. Flint gathered them in the storage cellar behind the mercantile, the one building not connected to Veidt's original plans. The mayor rolled out maps, not of Unity Falls, but of beneath it. He had found them in the chapel archives, hidden behind loose planks in the vestry. Veidt's original sketches. Not just sermons, schematics. They built the town on top of something, Flint said. Look, Veidt planned every street, every foundation. And this spiral beneath the chapel. It's not sewage, it's ritual geometry. Grace traced the lines with trembling fingers. It's a sigil. Ruth frowned. A what? A binding mark, Grace whispered. Not to keep something out, but to hold something in. Elias looked up from his drawings. It's hungry. No one spoke. Widow Estelle took a deep breath. If the town is the vessel, she said, then the people are the voice. Which means, Flint added, if we can break the pattern, stop the synchronization, we may silence it. Isaac stood. Then we break the oldest rhythm, the chapel. Outside, the sky had begun to dim unnaturally, though it was only noon. The shadows stretched wrong, curling at their ends. Windows rattled with no wind. And from somewhere deep below, that hum began again. Not in air, in marrow, as if the bones of Unity Falls were beginning to sing. Mayor Flint led the group toward the chapel. They moved in silence, not by choice, but necessity. Speaking aloud had become too dangerous. They feared what voice might emerge. Even their thoughts felt intruded upon, as if the ground beneath their feet pulsed with half-formed sentences. The chapel's door stood ajar. No one had opened it. Inside, the sanctuary was empty, but not abandoned. The air was thick with the scent of oil and stone dust. The altar glowed faintly, the Hebrew carvings around its base now rearranged, not by hands, by something older than language. Elias pointed. The wooden floorboards behind the altar had shifted. Subtly, but unmistakably, a spiral seam now circled the pulpit. Isaac approached, dropping to his knees. With a crowbar from his coat, he pried at the edge. It lifted easier than expected. Beneath lay a staircase. They descended single file. The passage spiraled tightly, lit only by Isaac's lantern. The deeper they went, the warmer the air became. Not fire-warm, but womb-warm, moist, pulsing. The walls were not stone, but smooth, almost biological, as if carved from the inside out. At the base of the stairs stood a chamber, octagonal, carved with the same pulsing script seen beneath the river. In its center, a stone table. Upon it, a book that looked bound in something like hide, and next to it, something worse. It was a tongue, large dark gray, too large for any human mouth, yet shaped with anatomical precision, as if meant to be used. Grace turned away, swallowing bile. "It was a seed," she whispered, "a spoken seed." Flint nodded. "And the town is the soil." Ruth reached for the book. Isaac stopped her. "No," he said, voice sharp. "That's not scripture, it's a program." Elias, quiet until now, stepped forward. "It's not finished." They turned to him. His eyes were glazed, unfocused. "They're still writing it," he continued. "Through us. Every word we speak, every hymn, every shared thought. It adds to the script." Estelle stepped back. "Then what happens when it's complete?" No one answered. The humming intensified. The walls quivered. The table began to vibrate, the tongue twitching slightly as if tasting the air. Elias suddenly clutched his head and screamed. Not in pain, but in resonance. "The final phrase," he gasped. "They want me to say it." Grace grabbed him by the shoulders. "Don't." "But it's already in my mind." "Then we silence it." Flint raised his lantern and smashed it against the table. Flame erupted. The book caught immediately. So did the tongue. The fire didn't spread. It collapsed, as if the air itself withdrew in fear. The walls groaned. The spiral stairs behind them began to tremble. "Out!" Isaac bellowed. They fled the chamber. As they reached the sanctuary, the chapel itself began to buckle. Not with collapse, but with resistance. The floorboards hissed. The stained glass windows bled black. Then came the sound, a roar made of thousands of voices speaking in unison. But no words, only fury. Outside, Unity Falls shuddered. Buildings warped subtly, like faces reacting to pain. A wave of nausea swept through the remaining aligned villagers. Some collapsed, others screamed, but none could speak. The harmony was broken, but not undone. At the chapel steps, Flint turned to look one last time, and through the shattered window, he saw it, a shape. Not man, not beast. Rising briefly from the altar floor before vanishing into shadow. It had eyes. Too many. None human. And just before the roof caved in, he heard it again. The whisper. "You have delayed the unison, not silenced it." The words echoed long after the chapel collapsed into itself, not with fire, but implosion. Stones curled inward, beams folded. The roof sank as though inhaled. No rubble spilled outward, it vanished like a breath held too long. The villagers who stood beneath the sky during its fall made no sound. They only watched, heads tilted, eyes empty. Flint, Grace, Isaac, Estelle, Ruth, and Elias stood together on the chapel hill, too stunned to speak. Each felt the same dread, that what they'd witnessed was not an end, but an opening. A pause before the next movement. They scattered instinctively. Grace took Elias and fled to the schoolhouse, where she boarded up the windows and drew chalk symbols on the floor. Symbols pulled from Elias's drawings, not her books. Isaac returned to his workshop, hammering wooden spikes into the foundation beams, muttering prayers between each strike. Estelle, armed with salt and candlelight, circled her home in silence. Ruth vanished into the woods with nothing but a shawl and a lantern, seeking the hill where the silver grass first grew. Mayor Flint stayed. He walked the edge of the chapel's crater alone. Its depth defied logic. No soil, no stone, only black, not absence, but a presence in reverse, as if something had eaten its way upward. He dropped a pebble. No sound followed. By morning, the townspeople resumed their routines, but something was wrong. Not wrong like illness, wrong like imitation. Grace watched children play their familiar games, but with mechanical rhythm, every ball toss caught, every hop identically paced. They laughed, but it came all at once, at the same pitch. She tried asking questions. What did you dream? What's your favorite hymn? Who is your mother? The children smiled, tilting their heads, and responded in perfect harmony. The one voice knows, the one voice hears. She stopped asking after that. Isaac discovered the iron nails in his shop now bent subtly, curving toward the east wall. Every compass he owned spun in slow, clockwise circles. The horses refused to enter their stalls, gathering silently at the northern fence line, eyes wide, unblinking. One cow gave birth to a calf without a mouth. Estelle opened her Bible to the Psalms and found entire chapters rewritten. Not by hand, the ink had shifted. The verses no longer spoke of comfort or repentance, but of convergence. The tongues of men shall bind as one. The breath of all shall exhale as one. She burned the book and buried the ashes. Ruth returned after 2 days, trembling. She had climbed the hill where Veidt was rumored to have fasted before founding Unity Falls. The trees had bent toward its center. Grass grew in spirals, and in the soil, under her fingertips, she felt vibrations like heartbeats. She claimed she saw footprints, bare, deep, and spaced too far apart to belong to anything human. The six met again in Isaac's workshop, the only place that still smelled of ash and oil, not of bloodless air. We've delayed something, Flint began, but we've also provoked it. It's building, Grace said. Recovering, regrouping, learning, added Isaac. It now knows what broke the song. Estelle looked to Elias, who sat on a stool, eyes closed. He opened them slowly. It will try again, he said, calm, but not from beneath. They stared. It's found another tongue. Flint leaned forward. Where? Elias's lips barely moved. It's not where, it's when. They didn't understand. Not at first, but then the meaning crept in like dusk. The town was not just a vessel for a voice. It was a seed, and if that seed had spoken once in 1831, then its echo could bloom elsewhere, in another era, another village, another language, a recursion, a ritual, not bound by time, and far beyond Unity Falls, in some place not yet named, a child stirred in sleep and whispered words his parents had never taught him. The resonance had not died. It had only dispersed. What flickered in Unity Falls now glimmered faintly across distances, sowing syllables like spores. But the villagers did not know this yet. All they could see was the silence that followed the chapel's collapse, and that silence, unlike the harmony before it, was not peaceful. It felt withheld, as if something held its breath just beneath the surface. Isaac Bain kept busy. It was how he stayed sane. He rebuilt the beams of his home, not because they needed fixing, but to assert dominion over the wood, over matter itself. His hammer fell in patterns. 3 strikes, a pause, then 1. It wasn't until the 4th evening that he noticed the nails echoing back on the 4th beat, as if the house had learned his rhythm. Grace tried to teach again, but the children now mimicked each other perfectly. Not just in answers, but in posture, in breath, in blinking. A dropped pencil triggered 6 identical motions to pick it up. They spoke in turns, yet their sentences completed one another's thoughts. Elias refused to enter the classroom. It's a mirror now, he whispered. Not a school. Flint spent more time alone. He walked the edges of town with a small notebook, sketching strange symbols he saw etched into fence posts, into tree bark, even scratched beneath rocks. At first, he assumed they were remnants of Veidt's followers, but some were fresh. still moist. Carved recently. By what? He didn't know. They resembled neither letters nor pictures, but mouths. Open shapes, circular, waiting. Estelle confessed to hearing things at night, not voices, tones, single notes, always the same pitch, always in threes. She placed water glasses around her room and found they trembled with each sound. On the fifth night, one shattered. The next morning, the glass was whole again. Ruth came down with fever, not from sickness, but from what she called proximity. Her skin pulsed with warmth even as frost coated the windows. She spoke in riddles now, fragments. "The river walks," she said once. "The chapel was never ours." And most chilling of all, the tongue wants teeth. Elias had begun to draw new things. Not spirals, not symbols, faces, always the same face. No eyes, no mouth, but unmistakably watching. When asked who it was, he simply said, "The mouth that listens." It was Grace who first saw the flicker in the well, a shimmer just beneath the water like oil on glass. She leaned over, called out softly, and saw her own mouth move in the reflection, but heard no words. When she blinked, her reflection did not. She stumbled back, trembling. That night, all six returned to the mercantile cellar. Flint laid out the notebook of carvings. Grace brought a cloth with wet ink, an imprint from the well reflection. Isaac had sketched blueprints, drawing a map not of buildings, but of sounds, how tones had moved through the village. Estelle brought the shattered, then reformed glass. Together, the evidence formed a terrifying pattern. "The town is healing," Grace said. "No," Flint corrected. "It's reassembling." Isaac exhaled. "We broke its mouth, but not the brain behind it." "And now it's regrowing," Estelle whispered. "Through us," Elias added the final thought. "It doesn't need all of us, just enough to speak again." That night, the stars vanished, not with clouds, but with replacement. In their place appeared dozens of slow-blinking red orbs, stationary, silent, watching unity falls with the patience of ancient hunger. And somewhere underground, in the place where the chapel once stood, something pulsed once, like a heart remembering how to beat. The villagers did not speak of the stars anymore. They simply stopped looking up. Each red orb above Unity Falls now blinked in perfect rhythm, one every 10 seconds, in unison. Flint timed them with a cracked pocket watch. When he checked again, the watch had stopped, not because the gears had broken, but because the second hand now ticked only in time with the blinking, a machine obeying a signal. By day, Unity Falls resembled a town still alive. Chores continued, tools clanged, doors opened and shut. But no one spoke outside their homes. No birds returned. The trees never rustled. Sound itself had become suspect. Elias had grown paler, thinner. He no longer needed light to draw. His hand moved in darkness, scratching charcoal shapes onto paper. The same image, over and over, a mouth open wide, with a small wriggling air at its center. Grace begged him to stop, but he only answered, "It's learning to hear itself." Flint, once methodical, now paced like a caged man. He tried to write letters. To whom? He didn't know. The outside world felt fictional now, but his hands refused. Every time he tried to write "help," his pen traced the word "here." Estelle's candles now burned cold. Their flames gave light, but no warmth. She held one near her skin and felt nothing. But she dreamed vividly of being underground, whispering into the dirt, teaching it grammar. Isaac's workshop betrayed him. The hammer he trusted slipped from his hand and landed upright, tip buried in the floorboards, without force. Nails curled inward like frightened insects. Even the wood grain shifted, revealing swirls that echoed the spiral beneath the old chapel. He moved his tools outside, into the frost, and worked in the open. Then Ruth returned from the forest, carrying a sack. She wouldn't speak. Not until night. Then she opened it, revealing 12 small stones, each carved with a different symbol, but not by human hands. "They grow from the ground," she said. "I watched one rise like a seedling. It waited until I looked away." The stones pulsed faintly. Isaac ran his fingers over them and felt warmth. Elias wouldn't touch them. "They're syllables," he whispered. "When they all come together, the mouth opens again." The group laid the stones in a circle, each pulsed to a different rhythm. Grace noticed something eerie. The intervals between pulses were closing, converging. "They're sinking," she said. "They're almost ready to speak." It was Elias who made the proposal. "We must scatter them, separate their meaning." Ruth shook her head. "They came together for a reason. And if we let them complete the phrase," Isaac added, "we'll become the sentence." They argued until dusk. Then the stones spoke, not in sound, in thought. Each person heard a voice in their mind, not commanding, but offering a proposal wrapped in serenity. "You need not fight," it said. "You need not fear. You may still join the voice and never be alone again." Estelle collapsed first, not from pain, but from relief. She wept, laughing, whispering, I missed it so much, the silence between thoughts." Flint slapped her. She didn't flinch. Grace picked up one of the stones and threw it hard into the woods. It didn't land. It vanished midair. Elias screamed. "They're listening now, from us, through us." The pulsing quickened. Then, without warning, every mirror in Unity Falls cracked down the center, not shattered, just a single, perfect line down each reflection, as if the town itself had blinked, and from the well, the hum began again. Not just in Unity Falls, but everywhere a voice had ever echoed without origin. Flint awoke to blood on his pillow, not his own, but traced in 2 small, perfect circles. On the walls of his home, muddy fingerprints appeared overnight, arranged like quotation marks. The house didn't feel inhabited. It felt inhabiting. Even silence had a shape now. He no longer slept, only faded. Elias refused food. Not in protest, but because he claimed the drawings now fed him. "They drip meaning," he murmured, "like marrow through old bones." Grace tried to burn the pages, but they wouldn't catch. Fire recoiled, as if repelled. She buried them instead, but the next morning, each sheet lay at the foot of her bed, unburnt, undirtied, waiting. The other villagers began to speak again, but not of normal things. They recited fragments of forgotten languages. Whole conversations flowed without punctuation or awareness. Even babies cooed in rhythmic pulses. Ruth swore she heard one infant say, "I remember the first alignment." Estelle vanished for 2 days. When she returned, she wore a cloak she claimed she'd sewn herself, but no one recognized the fabric. It shimmered faintly, like the silver water from months earlier. She said nothing, only stared at Isaac and whispered, "He's still carving." Isaac, terrified, checked his own hands. They were blistered. The tools had moved in his sleep. In the shop behind his home, a new altar had appeared, half-finished, jagged and organic. Not nailed, but fused. It smelled of wet earth and milk. "I never touched a thing," he whispered. That night, Grace made her decision. She led Flint, Elias, and Ruth back to the river's edge. The silver shimmer had spread, not just in the water, but along the rocks, the soil, even the trees. Everything now carried a sheen, as if the world was becoming reflective. "It's a throat," Grace said suddenly. "The entire town, from the spiral beneath the chapel to the streets to the river. We are in a larynx." Flint didn't laugh. "Then what's speaking?" Ruth answered. "Not what. Who?" That word rang differently. It didn't feel human. It felt historic, the same way a name might feel after centuries of silence. Elias knelt beside the river, placed his ear near the surface. Then he spoke clearly, for the first time in days. "It's not an entity," he said. "It's a memory trying to reassemble itself." They stared. "It left something behind," he went on. "A linguistic ghost, the shape of a voice. We're not being possessed, we're being remembered." The others reeled in silence. A ghost of speech, a sentient echo? And then came the first true fracture. The widow Estelle, back in her home, opened her mouth to pray, and couldn't. Her tongue twisted backward, her jaw moved sideways, yet the words came anyway, spilling out in voices not her own, 4 tones at once. Male, female, child, elder. They poured from her in painful intervals until she collapsed. By dawn, 12 villagers had done the same. The voice was reassembling. Isaac proposed destroying the river, damming it off with fire and earth. But Grace shook her head. "You can't dam a sound." Elias pointed to the sky. "It's almost here." The stars no longer blinked red. They had turned white, then violet, then a color none of them had a word for. Flint, watching through the broken lens of his old telescope, saw the truth. The lights weren't above. They were reflections. Something was beneath Unity Falls, buried deep enough to curve light itself. The stars were being mimicked. He dropped the telescope. It wasn't watching them from the sky. It was looking up from below. The stars they had feared were not celestial at all. They were echoes, reflections projected by something deep, impossibly deep, beneath the foundations of Unity Falls. A thing that remembered light, remembered speech, remembered being seen. And now it was trying to see back. Grace collapsed when Flint told her. Not from disbelief, but from a sudden, seizing recognition. Her eyes rolled back. Her throat convulsed. She screamed in a tone that wasn't hers, a sound not made by lungs. Elias ran to her side and held her arms as she spasmed. Her mouth moved independently, lips twitching to syllables older than language. Then she went still and whispered, "It has almost finished translating itself." Isaac built a cage of iron in his barn. He lined it with mirrors, cracked, warped, salvaged from abandoned homes. Inside, they placed the silver stones Ruth had found, each sealed in wax, each enclosed in salt. Flint didn't believe in any of it, not truly, but belief no longer mattered. Ritual had become function. "We have 3 days," Elias said flatly. "Maybe less." "How do you know?" Flint asked. Elias showed his palms. Lines had formed, etched like ink, glyphs, coordinates, a countdown in runes. "It's writing through me now," he said. "I'm the final sentence." That night, Estelle set fire to her home. She stood outside, watching it burn, humming softly. Her hands clutched a book she swore was Veidt's true journal, not the one in the chapel archive, but one hidden beneath the altar's original foundation. She gave it to Flint without a word. Inside were notes, not of sermons or salvation, but of sound. Diagrams of mouths, throats, lungs, phonetic tables interspersed with diagrams of soil strata, and one phrase repeated again and again. Language is structure, structure is body, voice is resurrection. Grace awoke at midnight and found herself outside, barefoot, standing knee-deep in the river. She had no memory of leaving the house. Around her, 5 others stood in silence. Children, elders, all with mouths open, but no sound. Then the water shifted. Not outward, but upward, a ripple that didn't disturb the surface. Instead, it rose in a dome around them, a transparent veil. In its distortion, she saw not reflections, but futures. Dozens of towns, different years, different names, but the same voice, the same convergence, the same alignment. Grace screamed and the dome shattered. Water splashed. The others dropped instantly, unconscious. She dragged herself to shore, trembling. The town clock, long silent, struck once. A tone, not a chime. Flint read Veidt's journal aloud by candlelight, skipping only the final page, which was covered in a single sigil that pulsed faintly even in the dark. "We are not haunted," he said. "We are understood." Isaac sharpened tools not to build, but to destroy. He made stakes not of wood, but of iron root, the black timber from the northern ridge, which nothing ever grew near. Ruth stopped speaking entirely. She'd drawn a map of Unity Falls, but it wasn't physical. It was sonic, places of resonance, wells of amplification. The school, the river bend, the forge, each marked with a ring and a single word: mouth. Elias began to fade. Not physically, but perceptually. People would glance past him, forget he'd entered the room, forget he'd spoken, and when he did speak, the sound came from behind them. "I'm becoming the echo," he said. Flint no longer denied it. The town was transforming, not decaying, not possessed. It was being reformatted. The Unison was nearly ready, and from beneath the rubble of the chapel came a sound no one expected. Knocking, 3 soft raps, then silence. Then again, 3, regular, calm, as though politeness had learned to echo. Isaac was the first to approach the crater, lantern held high, face drained. The rubble had shifted. Stones that had once cradled sermons and sacraments now breathed with faint warmth. Something beneath them wanted acknowledgement, not entry. Flint joined him, pistol in hand, though they both knew bullets would offer no meaning in this new grammar of phenomena. The wind around the chapel site no longer moved. It paused, then reversed subtly, like an inhalation in slow motion. The grass leaned toward the crater. Listening, they waited. The knocks did not repeat. Instead, a voice came, not aloud, but around. "Permission to speak?" The question coiled through their skulls, threading thought like a whispered inheritance. Isaac shook. Flint whispered, "It's asking." Behind them, Grace arrived with Ruth and Estelle. Elias was already there. No one had seen him arrive. He simply was, standing at the crater's lip, head tilted toward the dark. He nodded once. "You may speak." What followed was not a sentence, but a collapse of sound into shape. The voice did not use words. It became meaning. It conjured sensation and memory as language. Every person heard a different truth, yet all understood the same thing. The thing beneath was not Veidt, not a demon, not a god. It was a residual intelligence, a failed language. The memory of speech discarded at the beginning of time, left behind when creation chose sound over silence. It had waited beneath layers of history for a tongue to open wide enough, a people quiet enough, a structure aligned enough to reassemble its fragments. Unity Falls had been its attempt, and it was nearly finished. Isaac fell to his knees. Why us? The answer came not in mercy, but in inevitability, because you listened. Flint's hands trembled. Then what now? Elias turned slowly, face pale but eyes bright. "Now we choose," he said. "Either complete the phrase, or tear the mouth out of the earth before it can finish." Estelle dropped Veidt's journal into the crater. It didn't fall. It hovered, pages flipping backward, ending not where the writing stopped, but where the speaking began. The final page no longer held a sigil. It now bore a phrase in every language known to man, and several unknown. The phrase translated, roughly, as, "Let me finish remembering myself." Ruth spoke for the first time in days. What if it's not malevolent? What if it only wants to exist? Grace shook her head. Intent doesn't matter. Structure does. If it speaks fully, if it remembers completely, then our world becomes its echo chamber. Elias stood at the edge, arms raised. Then silence it. Isaac lit the fuse. They had packed the foundation with gunpowder, iron filings, and salt. They'd rigged it over weeks. A last hope. The town had been the throat. The chapel had been the tongue. The river was the breath. This explosion would be the gag. The fuse sparked, snaking downward, but just before the flame reached the heart of the structure, the ground spoke back. Not with words, with names. Each person heard their name, spoken not as address, but as ownership, as if the thing beneath had authored them, as if it was not awakening, but recalling. The flame hesitated, and in that moment of doubt, the final alignment began. Throughout Unity Falls, mouths opened, not people's, buildings, wells, trees split down the center, rocks cracked in spirals, doors breathed, the sky itself darkened, not with storm, but with exhalation. The countdown had ended. The voice was ready, and it began to speak. It was not a sound that passed through ears. It was a vibration that unfolded inside the ribcage, a sentence made of sensation, not syllables. Flint dropped to his knees. His spine arched. His lungs trembled. He felt like he was being hollowed from within, made room for something else. Not possession. Translation. Every surface in Unity Falls vibrated. Glass hummed. Water rippled without wind. The iron fence around the schoolyard twisted into new symbols. One child opened her mouth and recited perfect Latin, though she had never learned to read. The stones Ruth collected cracked open. From their centers oozed a black ichor that shimmered with reflected memories. Estelle cried out. It smelled like her mother's voice, like her own heartbeat as an infant. Grace tried to speak, to protest, but her jaw would not obey. Her tongue rolled forward and clicked once, involuntarily. The sound echoed, triggering 3 identical clicks in the distance. The town responded. Not in language. In agreement, Isaac, who had remained near the crater, lit a final torch. He threw it down, but it was absorbed mid-air, devoured by the shimmer. The thing beneath had learned to consume fire. Destruction no longer worked. Elias was no longer among them. He had stepped into the center of the crater, arms raised, and his body began to change. Not grotesquely, not violently. It simply became less Elias, as though transparency was replacing identity. "You feared silence," he said, voice echoing beyond his mouth. "But you forgot the first sound, the one before all others, the sound of knowing." Ruth tried to climb down to stop him. Her hands blistered upon touching the earth. It burned with memory, with the recollection of worship, of obedience, of form. "Listen," Elias shouted. Not in command, but invitation. And they all heard it, their own thoughts, not echoing, but spoken aloud. Estelle heard her deepest guilt, the child she abandoned in 1809. Flint heard the names of those he'd failed as mayor, one by one in his own voice. Grace heard her father's last breath, though she hadn't been there to witness it. Unity Falls was no longer a town. It was a resonating chamber. Every structure, every root, every person had become part of the throat. The voice was not invading. It was compiling. Veidt had not summoned a demon. He had sculpted a mouth. Every sermon, every hymn, every ritual. They had been phonetics, tongue exercises, the training of breath and pitch. And now the speech had begun. But then, a break, a flaw. Not all sounds aligned, not all mouths opened. One remained closed. Elias turned his head sharply, mid-sentence. The voice faltered, the harmony hiccuped, and from that fracture came a different voice. A child's cry, not in unison, not echoed, a single, raw, human sound. It came from the schoolhouse. Grace ran. Inside, a boy, Thomas Hale, 6 years old, sat alone in the corner, hands over his ears, weeping. He had not joined the harmony. His voice was his own, and the town recoiled. The stones cracked further. The ichor hissed and burned the earth it touched. The trees groaned. The crater trembled. Grace gathered the boy into her arms and shouted toward the sky, "You don't own him." And for the first time, the voice responded with tone. Not thought. He was written. "No," Grace hissed. "He was born." And as the boy wept louder, the alignment stuttered. The voice, so ancient, so perfect, coughed, buildings convulsed, rivers reversed, and beneath it all, in the dark pit where the chapel once stood, something enormous exhaled in confusion. It was not rage, it was not pain, it was disruption. The voice had remembered too much, too quickly, and in doing so, had revealed a weakness. A human sound had entered its structure, uninvited, and created discord, a flaw in the symphony, a missed note in the unison. Grace cradled young Thomas in her arms, whispering to him, shielding his ears. She didn't know why his cry mattered, only that it had not harmonized. It had diverged, and that divergence had broken something. Outside, the wind returned. Not the reverse breathing of the voice, but real wind, the kind that carried dust and scent and entropy. Flint stood on the steps of his home, feeling it against his skin like the first touch of memory after a long illness. He raised his head. The stars above no longer blinked. They shimmered as if uncertain of their reflection. Estelle, watching from the riverbank, gasped. The silver shimmer was gone. The water was dark again. Still, yes, but no longer mirroring. The river had remembered how to flow in one direction. But in the crater, Elias still stood, frozen mid-transformation. His face was a map of unspoken syntax, his limbs etched with phrases and ancient geometries, yet even he looked skyward now, confused. "I hear myself," he murmured. Isaac arrived at Grace's side. He carried the iron root stake he'd fashioned weeks earlier, not for demons, not for ghosts, but for truths that had overstayed their welcome. "We end this," he said quietly. Grace hesitated. "It's Elias." "No," Isaac replied. "Elias was the page. This thing is the ink." They walked toward the crater. Elias turned. Something behind his eyes flickered. Recognition, maybe even sorrow. "It never wanted to rule," he said. "Only to exist. And that," Grace whispered, "is too much." As they approached, the voice tried once more. It spoke through soil, through bone, through pulse. The words came in a cascade of sensations: pleasure, certainty, comfort. "You may still join," it said, but now even the villagers heard the desperation. It sounded like an invitation to sleep forever, to dissolve, to become one more chord in an unbroken drone. They did not reply. Isaac drove the stake into the ground beside Elias's feet, not into him, but into the soil from which the unison rose. The iron root cracked the surface, and for a moment, everything screamed. Not aloud, not around them, but inside them. Their own thoughts turned against them, rebelling, repelling the intrusion. The voice convulsed. Elias fell backward, unconscious, and in the crater, a figure emerged. Not monstrous, not divine, just wrong. It looked like a man sculpted from sentence. Its skin shimmered with verbs. Its breath came in punctuation. Its eyes were quotation marks. It reached toward Grace, and its hand was a question. But before it could speak, Thomas cried out again, a single, high-pitched wail. This time, the sound didn't just disrupt. It silenced. The figure cracked at the edges. Its skin turned from grammar to static. And it whispered, almost tenderly, "I was nearly whole." Then it fell inward. Not down, not away, but inward, into itself, collapsing into silence. And in that instant, every mirror in Unity Falls went black, not shattered, just blank, as if the world no longer needed reflection. Flint staggered forward, pulled Elias for the crater's edge. The boy was breathing, human again. Ruth fell to her knees and began to hum. Not the unison, a lullaby, off-key, blessedly imperfect. And Unity Falls, for the first time in months, felt quiet, not emptied, not silenced, but finally, imperfectly, its own. The silence that followed was not empty, but earned. It held weight, it carried the residue of struggle, of resistance, of something ancient being refused its final syllable. Flint sat on the chapel steps, now just a broken rim of stone. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from fatigue. Beside him, Elias slept, head cradled in Ruth's lap, chest rising and falling like a metronome reclaimed from possession. The sky above returned to familiar stars, dim, indifferent, utterly human. The orbs were gone. No more pulsing rhythms, no more mirrored skies, just cold air and the faint smell of ash. Grace buried the iron root stake at the chapel's center. She said nothing. No prayers, no declarations, just a spade into dirt. The others watched. There was no ceremony, only necessity, as if closing the throat of something that had almost spoken a second creation. Estelle sat at the schoolhouse, drawing again. But not symbols, not spirals. She drew people, her neighbors, her friends, even herself. Every face bore imperfection, wrinkles, scars, eyes that weren't quite symmetrical. She smiled through tears. "We're crooked again," she whispered. The villagers gathered in small clusters, no longer unified, no longer synchronized. Some wept, some laughed, some simply stood still, relearning how to be alone inside their own minds. One man clapped just once, startling everyone. The sound echoed off the empty buildings and did not return as harmony. It returned as itself. The voice was gone, but its residue lingered. At the river's edge, Ruth found something buried beneath the rocks, not a relic, a seed, smooth, black, almost warm. She held it only for a moment before casting it into the water. It sank without ripple. "We don't archive this," she said firmly. "We forget it. But forgetting would be a luxury not easily earned." In Flint's home, the mirror remained blank, not shattered, not reflective, just absent. When he leaned close, he saw nothing, not even darkness, a space without feedback. He covered it with cloth and did not remove it again. Elias recovered slowly. He remembered fragments. "It wasn't cruel," he said, "just unfinished." He paused, like a song someone forgot the ending to. The phrase haunted them all, because though the voice had collapsed, though the mouth had closed, they each feared what remained beneath. Not the structure, not the sound, but the possibility that somewhere, beneath layers of dirt and meaning, the shape of that language still waited to be spoken again. And so the villagers made a pact: no retelling, no sermons, no legacy. Unity Falls would become a place without records. Its past would be stitched only in silence and carried in crooked memories. The town would be known for nothing, unremarkable, forgotten. A map maker passed through months later. He was never given directions. The chapel was never rebuilt. The schoolhouse returned to lessons, ordinary ones. Numbers, history, stories with beginnings and endings that stayed put. Grace taught again. Elias drew again. Estelle hummed broken tunes with joy, but occasionally, in the stillness between night and morning, someone would wake in bed and hear it. Faint, deep below the floorboards. Not a voice, not a knock, just the faintest impression of rhythm. 3 pulses. A pause, then one. A heartbeat that wasn't theirs, and though no one spoke of it, they knew. The voice had not died. It had simply been interrupted. And interruptions, as history proves, are never endings. They are pauses, breath between verses, silence between battalions. Unity Falls returned to the world like a shadow, fading into dusk, slowly, deliberately, without explanation. No one from the outside came looking. The post stopped arriving. Trade faded. the roads grew over with grass, and those who remained within its borders preferred it that way. They lived not as survivors, but as people who had chosen to carry a secret in the shape of absence. Flint kept to himself. His title as mayor meant nothing now. He no longer led. He simply stayed. In the mornings, he swept the chapel ruins, not to rebuild, but to ensure nothing grew back. No sprout, no mouth, no memory. Grace taught children the beauty of questions again, not answers, not absolutes, just the strange, awkward art of not knowing. Her classroom was filled with laughter that didn't echo, and drawings that made no sense. It was perfect. Elias painted a new mural in the town square. He called it Disagreement. It showed nothing but color. No forms, no patterns. People argued over what it meant. That was the point. Estelle passed away quietly in her sleep the following spring. She was buried in the eastern field beneath a crooked stone that read only, "Slightly off key." No sermon was spoken, only a melody hummed badly on purpose. Time passed, or maybe it didn't. The villagers no longer marked it with clocks. Rhythms had become suspicious. Patterns, too. No one built anything symmetrical. Every window was slightly tilted. Doors were carved with unrepeatable knots. The river was left unmeasured. No bridges. And yet, one morning, Ruth found something in her garden, a shape just beneath the soil. Not a stone, not a root, a glyph. Weathered, faint, but unmistakable. She didn't touch it. She buried it deeper and walked away. Later that year, Thomas, the boy whose cry had disrupted the voice, stood at the edge of the woods. He was older now, but his eyes held that same strange defiance. He held a slingshot in one hand and a notebook in the other. The pages were blank. He didn't write. He listened. That night, he asked Grace a question. What if we didn't stop it? What if it just changed shape? Grace, who had once spoken ancient syllables in her sleep, paused for a long time. Then she answered, "Then we learn to recognize it before it remembers us again." It became an unspoken rule. No rhythm longer than 3, no repeated patterns, no chanting, no symmetry, no mass gatherings, no amplified speech, and above all, never speak in unison, not even by accident. One child, years later, was sent home for mimicking his friend's sentence during a game. Grace didn't scold him. She simply knelt and whispered, "We don't echo here." He never did it again. By 1850, maps no longer listed Unity Falls. The railroads bypassed it. Travelers reported strange feelings passing nearby. Headaches, déjà vu, the taste of salt on dry wind. The town became folklore, a rumor told in taverns, a village that once spoke with one voice and then chose silence. They said the ground there pulses still, but no one has dared to dig, because some stories should end unfinished. Some tongues should stay buried, and some voices, when interrupted, should never be given the breath to begin again.